Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The Arizona desert has a way of making you feel small, especially when you're alone on Highway 87, with nothing but red rocks and dried bushes for company. I was halfway between Phoenix and Albuquerque that Sunday afternoon, driving my old Camry toward a job interview that meant everything to me after 3 months of unemployment. At 32, freshly divorced, I'd learned to appreciate these long solo drives as a kind of meditation, a chance to organize my thoughts while the miles rolled by. The marketing firm where I'd worked for 7 years had collapsed suddenly, taking my stability with it, and this startup position felt like my chance to rebuild. The dashboard clock showed 2:17 p.m. The outside temperature gauge hit 108 degrees, and I had about 8 more hours of driving ahead when I spotted him standing by the roadside. He wasn't hitchhiking exactly, but waving both arms above his head in that frantic way people do when something's really wrong. The man appeared to be in his mid-40s, wearing khaki pants and a light blue button-down that had massive sweat stains spreading from the armpits down to his waist. His hair caught my attention immediately, this unusual reddish-brown color, thinning dramatically on top but hanging long and stringy in the back, like he'd been growing out a bad haircut for months. Thick-rimmed glasses kept sliding down his nose as he waved, and his face was so sunburned it looked painful. There was absolutely nothing around us for miles in either direction, just endless stretches of cracked earth and the shimmer of heat rising from the asphalt. My first instinct was to keep driving, but the complete isolation of the place made me ease off the gas pedal. I pulled over about 20 feet ahead of him, watching in my rearview mirror as he jogged toward my car. He moved weird, kind of sideways like his left hip bothered him, and he kept wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. When he reached my passenger window, I only cracked it down about 3 inches, keeping my doors locked. Up close, I could see his eyes were this pale green color, almost gray, and they didn't quite focus on me when he spoke. "Thank God you stopped," he said, and his voice had this raspy quality like he'd been yelling for hours. "My truck died about 2 miles back, just completely dead, and my phone's got no signal out here. I just need a ride to the next town, Holbrook I think, so I can call a tow truck." His breath smelled sour, like old coffee mixed with something metallic, and there were these tiny scratches all over his hands that looked fresh. The smart thing would have been to offer to call someone for him when I got signal, and drive away. But standing there in that heat, seeing the sweat literally dripping off his chin, I felt guilty. I told him I could take him as far as Holbrook, which was only about 30 miles ahead according to my GPS. He practically collapsed into my passenger seat when I unlocked the door, immediately adjusting all the air vents to blow directly on his face. "You're a lifesaver, seriously," he kept saying. But then he did something that made my chest tighten. He locked his door and adjusted the side mirror to look behind us, not at the road, but at my back seat. He introduced himself as Gary, said he was a solar panel salesman from Tucson. But when I asked about his truck, what kind it was or what happened exactly, his answers kept changing. First it was a Ford, then a Chevy. First the engine seized, then the transmission went out. We'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes when Gary started giving me directions. "Take the next exit," he said, pointing at a barely visible dirt road turnoff. I told him Holbrook was straight ahead on the highway, probably another 20 minutes. No, there's a shortcut," he insisted, his hand actually reaching toward the steering wheel before pulling back. "I drive this route all the time for work. Trust me, it cuts off like 15 minutes, brings you right into town near the Chevron station." The thing is, I checked my GPS before picking him up, and there was only one road to Holbrook from where we were. But he kept insisting, getting agitated, tapping his fingers on his knee in this rapid, nervous rhythm. His whole demeanor had changed from grateful to pushy, and he kept looking at the door locks like he was checking they were still engaged. I kept driving straight, ignoring his directions, which made him shift constantly in his seat. He started talking faster, rambling about random things. His ex-wife in Flagstaff, a dog he used to have named Duke, how the desert used to be an ocean millions of years ago. None of it connected, like he was just filling the silence with noise. Then he asked if I had any water, and when I pointed to my bottle in the cup holder, he grabbed it and drank the entire thing without asking, water dribbling down his chin onto his shirt. Sorry, he muttered, but he wasn't looking at me when he said it. Instead, he was staring at my purse on the floor behind my seat, and that's when I noticed he'd unbuckled his seatbelt. He claimed it was cutting into his sunburn, but the way he angled his body toward me, I could feel every survival instinct in my body starting to scream. Actually, you know what? Take that exit coming up, Gary said again. But this time his voice had dropped lower, lost all the friendliness from before. The exit he was pointing to wasn't even a real exit, just a service road that disappeared behind a cluster of rocks. My buddy lives out that way. He's got a tow truck. He'll help me out for free. I gripped the steering wheel harder and told him I needed to stay on the highway, that I was running late for something important. His jaw clenched and he made this sound through his teeth, like a long hiss. "You don't understand," he said, and his right hand moved to rest on the dashboard, fingers spread wide. "I really need to go that way. Just do me this favor, okay? After everything, you picking me up and all." The way he said "after everything" made no sense. I'd known him for 20 minutes. But there was this weight to it, this implied threat that made my foot instinctively press harder on the gas. That's when he told me something that made my whole body go rigid. "Your license plate?" he said almost casually. "Arizona MVD 4K1892. That's easy to remember. My brother works at the DMV. Funny how small the world is." He wasn't looking at me when he said it, just staring straight ahead through the windshield, but the message was clear. He'd memorized my plate, wanted me to know he had it. My mouth went completely dry, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. We were doing about 75 miles per hour, and suddenly dropping him off in Holbrook seemed impossibly far away. He started describing the route again to this supposed friend's house. 2 miles down the service road, left at an old cattle guard, past 3 Joshua trees growing close together. The detail was too specific, too rehearsed, like he'd said it before to other people. I started calculating my options while trying to keep my face neutral. We were still about 15 miles from Holbrook, no other cars visible in either direction, and my phone was in the cup holder between us where he could easily grab it. Gary had gone quiet again, but his breathing had gotten heavier, and I could smell that metallic scent from his breath filling the car despite the AC running full blast. Then he did something that nearly made me swerve. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folding knife, claimed he needed to clean his fingernails. He opened it slowly, the blade maybe 3 inches long, and started picking at his nails with deliberate, careful movements. "Nervous habit," he explained without me asking. But he held the knife in a way where the blade was always pointed vaguely in my direction, catching the sunlight through the window. My exit strategy came from pure adrenaline and desperation. I suddenly pointed at the temperature gauge on my dashboard and said, "Oh God, the engine's overheating. I need to pull over right now." Before Gary could respond, I hit the brakes hard and swerved onto the shoulder, bringing the car to an abrupt stop that threw him forward against the dashboard. While he was off balance, I grabbed my phone, threw my door open, and ran. I didn't even look back at first, just sprinted along the highway's shoulder, screaming into my phone for 911. When I finally glanced behind me, Gary was out of the car but not chasing me. He was just standing by the passenger door, that knife still in his hand, watching me with those unfocused, pale eyes. The really terrifying part was how calm he looked. Like this was just a minor inconvenience in his day. A truck driver stopped within 2 minutes of my 911 call. Apparently, I'd been screaming loud enough that he'd seen me from half a mile away. He was this huge guy named Frank with a gray beard, and he immediately put himself between me and my car, where Gary was still standing. But here's the part that haunts me. By the time the police arrived 12 minutes later, Gary was gone. My car was still there, doors open, his sweat stains still visible on the passenger seat, my empty water bottle on the floor. But he'd vanished into the desert like he'd never existed. The cops searched for about an hour, brought in a helicopter to scan the area but found nothing. No abandoned truck 2 miles back like he'd claimed, no footprints leading into the desert, nothing. They took my report seriously, especially after they ran the description and found 2 similar incidents in New Mexico from the previous year. Women traveling alone, picked up a distressed man, managed to escape when he tried to redirect them to isolated areas. I made it to Albuquerque 6 hours late, stayed in a motel that night with a chair propped against the door, and bombed the interview the next morning because I couldn't stop scanning every man's face to see if it was him. The detective assigned to my case called me a week later to tell me they'd found something disturbing. 3 miles down that service road Gary had wanted me to take, past an old cattle guard and 3 Joshua trees growing together exactly like he'd described, there was an abandoned trailer with no power or water. Inside, they found women's jewelry, 3 different purses, and a notebook with license plate numbers, including mine already written at the bottom. They never found Gary, or whoever he really was, but they linked those items to missing persons cases going back 4 years. I still take road trips sometimes, can't let fear control my life, but I never stop for anyone now, no matter how desperate they look. And sometimes I wonder about the women who owned those purses, if they'd also thought they were just being helpful when they pulled over. Last February, I was driving from Colorado to California for a job interview that could have changed everything. I'd been unemployed for 3 months after my company downsized, and this opportunity at a tech startup in San Diego felt like my lifeline. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning, and I'd decided to drive instead of flying because I needed my car once I got there. Plus, honestly, I couldn't really afford the plane ticket. I was 32, recently divorced, and basically starting my life over. That 12-hour drive through the desert seemed like nothing compared to what I'd been through that year. I actually thought the solitude would do me good, give me time to practice my interview answers and clear my head. I'd made good time through Colorado and was somewhere in eastern Utah when the sun started setting. The landscape out there is beautiful during the day, all those red rocks and wide open spaces. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. There's nothing but darkness for miles, broken only by the occasional 18-wheeler passing in the opposite direction. My GPS showed the next major town was still 90 miles away, and my gas gauge was hovering just above a quarter tank. I knew I should have filled up at the last exit, but I'd been making such good progress that I didn't want to stop. When I finally saw the lights of a gas station glowing in the distance, maybe 2 miles ahead, according to a battered road sign, I actually said, "Thank God," out loud to nobody. It was one of those old independent stations, not a Shell or Exxon, just a place called Desert Stop Fuel and Food, with hand-painted letters on a wooden sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The moment I pulled up to the pump, something about the place made my chest tighten. All the lights were on, which should have been reassuring, but they had this harsh fluorescent quality that made everything look washed out and sickly. There were no other cars at the pumps, though I could see an old Ford pickup parked around the side of the building, covered in so much dust it looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The pump itself was ancient, one of those models where you had to lift the handle before selecting your grade, and when I tried to use my credit card, the reader just blinked error over and over. I waited maybe 30 seconds, tried again, same result. Through the station's windows, I could see someone moving around inside, a tall figure in what looked like a blue work shirt. I really didn't want to go in, but I needed gas badly, and the next station could be another 50 miles for all I knew. The door chimed when I pushed it open, one of those old mechanical bells that sounds too loud in the silence. The attendant was already walking toward me from behind the counter, and immediately something about his movement seemed wrong. He wasn't walking so much as gliding, taking these long, deliberate steps like he'd been waiting specifically for me. He was probably in his 50s, completely bald with skin that looked too tight on his skull. And he had these pale gray eyes that didn't quite focus on my face but seemed to look through me instead. "Card reader's broken," he said before I could even speak. And his voice had this weird flat quality, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. "Been broken all week. You'll need to come back here to the office. Got some paperwork for manual card processing. State regulation." The way he said it, turning his body sideways and gesturing toward a door marked "Employees only behind the counter," made every instinct in my body scream at me to leave. "I can just pay cash," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while taking a small step backward toward the door. The attendant's expression didn't change, but his head tilted slightly to the left, like a dog hearing a strange sound. "No cash transactions after dark," he said, still in that same monotone voice. "Company policy. Insurance reasons, you understand." He was already moving around the counter toward me, not rushing but not slow either, and that's when I noticed his hands. His fingernails were way too long for someone who worked at a gas station, and they were stained with something dark under the tips. "Won't take but a minute," he continued, now only about 6 feet away from me. "Just need your signature on the carbon copies. My manager, he's very particular about the paperwork." The way he emphasized the word manager made me glance toward the back of the store, and that's when I saw him. There was another man standing near the restroom hallway, partially hidden in the shadows but clearly watching us. He was younger, maybe mid-30s, wearing a stained white t-shirt and jeans, and he had this thick beard that looked matted and unkempt. What really got me was that he was just standing there, perfectly still, not pretending to shop or use the bathroom, just waiting. His eyes were locked on me, and he had his right hand in his pocket gripping something that made a bulge in the fabric. The attendant must have noticed me looking because he said, "That's just Carl. He helps out sometimes, especially with the paperwork." When Carl heard his name, he smiled, showing teeth that were all wrong, too many gaps, and what was there looked gray in the fluorescent light. He took one step forward, still keeping that hand in his pocket, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I went into that back office, I would never come out. I started backing up more deliberately toward the door, keeping my eyes on both men. "You know what? I just remembered I have enough gas to make it to the next town," I said, my voice coming out higher than normal. The attendant's face finally showed emotion, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "No, you don't," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Your tank's running on fumes. I watched you pull in. You were coasting." He was right, and the fact that he'd been watching me that closely made bile rise in my throat. Carl had started moving too, sliding along the wall toward the front of the store, trying to position himself between me and the exit. They'd done this before, I realized. They had a system. The broken card reader, the paperwork excuse. One man to guide victims to the back while the other blocked the exit. How many people had fallen for it? How many were buried somewhere out in that endless desert? "The lady said she wants to leave," came a voice from behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. A trucker had walked in, a massive guy in a Peterbilt cap and oil-stained coveralls. He looked at the attendant, then at Carl, and his expression made it clear he understood exactly what was happening. "I suggest you let her." The attendant's pale eyes flicked between me and the trucker, calculating. Carl had pulled his hand out of his pocket, and I could see the outline of what looked like a box cutter against his palm. For about 10 seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the humming of the refrigerators and my own ragged breathing. Then the trucker pulled out his phone and very deliberately started dialing. "State police patrol this stretch pretty regular," he said calmly. "Usually get here in about 15 minutes." That broke whatever spell was holding us all in place. The attendant stepped back behind his counter, his face completely blank again. "Pump 3 is working," he said in that same flat voice. "Pay at the pump." The trucker walked me to my car, positioning his body between me and the station windows the entire time. "Don't look back," he said quietly. "Just pump your gas and get the hell out of here. I'll stay until you're gone." My fingers were shaking so badly I could barely get my card to work, but this time the reader accepted it immediately. While the gas pumped, the trucker told me he'd stopped here about a year ago and got the same routine. Only difference was, I had my buddy with me. Soon as they saw there were two of us, they backed off. But I started asking around at truck stops and I heard stories. Women traveling alone who went missing on this stretch. Men too sometimes. The pump clicked off at 12 gallons, and I practically threw the nozzle back in its holder. Through my peripheral vision, I could see both men standing at the window now, just watching. Before I got in my car, the trucker handed me a business card. "That's my company's dispatch number," he said. "You call them when you get somewhere safe, let them know you made it. If we don't hear from you in 2 hours, I'm sending the cops back here." I thanked him, probably not coherently, and got in my car. As I pulled out, my headlights swept across the station, and I saw something that made my whole body go cold. There was a third person now, a woman, standing in the doorway of that back office. She was wearing what looked like a waitress uniform, but it was filthy and torn. She was mouthing something at me, the same word over and over, and even though I couldn't hear her, I could read her lips clearly. "Run." I floored it out of there, hitting 90 on that empty highway, constantly checking my rearview mirror for headlights that never came. I drove for 40 minutes straight before I stopped shaking enough to call the dispatch number. The woman who answered sounded relieved when I told her I was safe. "Bill called us right after you left," she said. "He's still there making sure they don't follow you. We've had 3 other people call us about that place in the past 6 months." She told me Bill was going to file another report with the state police, but that the station owners always had alibis, always had explanations. The broken card reader was real. The paperwork excuse was just believable enough, and nobody could ever prove anything more than bad feelings about the place. I made it to California, did my interview, got the job. But I looked up that gas station a few weeks later, needing some kind of closure. Desert Stop Fuel and Food had been in business for 37 years, owned by the same family the entire time. What really haunts me is what I found in the local news archives. Over those 37 years, 43 people had gone missing along that particular stretch of highway. The articles always mentioned them stopping for gas as their last known location, but never specifically at that station. The authorities attributed it to the dangers of desert driving, people getting lost on side roads, mechanical failures in remote areas. But I know better. I know what I saw in that woman's eyes behind the glass, the desperation and terror. I called the FBI tip line and told them everything, but without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The station is still there, still operating. Sometimes I check online reviews, and every few months there's a new 1-star rating from someone describing a creepy experience or weird vibes from the staff. But mixed in are enough normal reviews to keep it from seeming like anything more than a rundown gas station with poor customer service. I've thought about driving back there with a group of people, maybe a news crew, to expose what's really happening. But honestly, I'm too scared. I still have nightmares about those pale gray eyes and that woman mouthing "run" from the doorway. All I can do is share this story and hope it warns someone else. If you're ever driving through eastern Utah at night and see a place called Desert Stop Fuel and Food, keep driving. Don't stop, not even if you're running on empty. The Ford Ranger's temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone when I spotted him. I'd been nursing that piece of junk truck through the high desert for 3 hours, windows down because the AC died somewhere around mile marker 47, sweat making my shirt stick to the cracked vinyl seats. It was early August, that brutal kind of heat where the asphalt shimmers like water, and you can smell the rubber from your tires cooking on the pavement. I was heading to Reno for a casino job interview. 23 years old, hospitality degree fresh in hand, and desperate enough to drive 8 hours through nowhere for a chance at decent pay. The highway stretched empty in both directions, just sagebrush and volcanic rock as far as you could see. The kind of place where if you broke down, you'd be waiting hours for help. I'd been alone with nothing but static-filled radio and my own thoughts since leaving Portland at 4 in the morning. He stood on the shoulder of Highway 395 with his thumb out, and everything about him seemed wrong for that place. Clean gray hoodie, fresh jeans, brown hair perfectly combed like he'd just stepped out of a bathroom mirror. The small red backpack on his shoulder looked store-new, not a single dirt stain or sun fade on it. Most hitchhikers out here look like they've been living rough. Torn clothes, huge military surplus bags, that weathered look that comes from too many nights sleeping outside. But this guy could have been standing at a bus stop in downtown Portland. Maybe that's why I started slowing down. Or maybe it was just the loneliness of the drive, the way the desert makes you crave another human voice after hours of nothing but engine noise and wind. My foot moved to the brake before I'd really decided to stop, and I remember thinking how my mom would kill me if she knew I was picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over about 50 feet past him, watching in the rearview as he jogged up to the passenger door. Up close, I could see he was maybe 35, 40 at most, with this peculiar smoothness to his face like he'd never spent a day working outside. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and when he smiled, only the corners of his mouth moved while the rest of his face stayed completely still. "Thanks for stopping," he said as he climbed in, his voice soft and measured like a therapist or someone who works in customer service. He placed the red backpack between his feet instead of tossing it in the truck bed, keeping one hand on the top like he was protecting something fragile inside. The way he settled into the seat was careful, deliberate, adjusting his position twice before buckling the seatbelt. I noticed his fingernails were immaculate, filed perfectly even, and he smelled like laundry detergent, that artificial mountain breeze scent that comes from dryer sheets. "Where you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the empty highway. He didn't answer right away, just stared straight ahead at the road unwinding through the heat waves. Then he turned to me with that same partial smile and said, "Wherever you're going is fine." That should have been my first real warning, but I just laughed it off, told him I was heading to Reno and he was welcome to ride that far if he wanted. He nodded slowly, then asked, "You from Portland?" I hadn't mentioned Portland. I'd said I was coming from Oregon, sure, but never specified the city. When I asked how he knew, he pointed at my parking permit hanging from the rear view. Portland State University expired last month. "Good eye," I said, but something cold settled in my chest. He kept staring at it, reading every detail on that little piece of plastic like it was the most interesting thing in the world. We drove in silence for maybe 10 minutes, the only sound coming from the truck's struggling engine and the wind whipping through the open windows. Then he started with the questions. "You live alone in Portland?" Simple enough, but the way he asked it, leaning slightly toward me, made my skin prickle. I told him I had roommates, 2 guys from college, even though I actually lived in a studio by myself. "That's smart," he said, nodding like I'd passed some kind of test. "Young man like you, living alone in a city can be dangerous. People watch patterns, you know. Learn when you leave, when you come back, what time the lights go off." His fingers drummed against the red backpack, a steady rhythm like he was playing piano. "You tell your roommates about this interview?" I hadn't told anyone about the interview except my mom, but I lied again, said yeah, they knew where I was. He made this humming sound in his throat, not quite approval, not quite doubt. The questions kept coming, each one more specific than the last. "Your parents, they still together? Does your mom work nights or days? Any siblings living nearby?" He asked them casually, conversationally, like we were just 2 guys killing time on a long drive. But there was this intensity behind his pale eyes that made my jaw clench. I started giving shorter answers, vaguer responses, but he didn't seem bothered. When I tried to flip it around, ask him where he was from or what he did for work, he'd give these nothing answers. Here and there, or little bit of everything. At one point, he reached down to adjust his backpack, and that's when I saw it. The fabric stretched tight over something long and rigid inside, maybe 8 or 9 inches, with a distinct handle shape pressing against the material. Could have been a flashlight, I told myself. Could have been a dozen different things. But the way he noticed me looking, The way his hand immediately moved to cover that spot told me exactly what it was. My mind started racing through every option I had. We were doing 70 miles per hour on a highway with no shoulder room, rocky desert on both sides. Stopping suddenly would be suspicious, dangerous even. The next town, Lakeview, was still 40 miles away according to the last sign we'd passed. My phone sat in the cup holder between us, but I hadn't seen a single bar of signal for the last hour. I kept my breathing steady, eyes focused on the road, while my brain screamed at me to do something. Anything. The fuel gauge showed just under half a tank, enough to make it to Lakeview without stopping. That became my plan. Get to town, pull into somewhere public, make an excuse. Maybe say I needed to use the bathroom or grab food. Then I could disappear, call someone, get help. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, angling his body toward me, and asked, "You nervous about the interview?" The question felt like a test, like he was checking if I was still buying his harmless traveler act. "Yeah, a little," I managed, proud of how normal my voice sounded. "First real job interview since graduation." He nodded thoughtfully, then said something that made my blood turn to ice water. "The Silverado Resort, right? That's a nice place. My cousin worked there for a while in the kitchen. They do those background checks that go way back, even check your social media, your family's social media sometimes. They like to know everything about their employees." I'd never mentioned the name of the casino, never said Silverado Resort. My mouth went dry as sand while I tried to remember if I'd left any paperwork visible in the truck, but I knew I hadn't. Everything was in my duffel bag in the truck bed, zipped up tight. He kept talking, casual as anything, about the resort's layout, which floor the HR office was on, where they usually held interviews. Details someone would only know if they'd been there, or if they'd been researching. Planning. The truck's temperature gauge started climbing again, the needle creeping past the halfway mark toward the red zone. Perfect, I thought. An excuse. "Damn," I said, tapping the dashboard. "This thing's been overheating all morning. I might need to stop and let it cool down." The hitchhiker glanced at the gauge, then at me, and his expression changed for just a second. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "How far to the next town?" he asked. When I told him 40 miles, he reached into his backpack and I felt every muscle in my body tense. But he pulled out a water bottle, unopened, the plastic seal still intact. "Pour this on the radiator when we stop," he said. "Learned that trick from my dad. We don't need to stop in town, just pull over anywhere and let it cool. These empty stretches are perfect for that." The way he said perfect made my stomach twist into knots. He wanted me to stop in the middle of nowhere, just the two of us, nobody around for miles. I knew I had to make a choice fast. The temperature gauge kept climbing, and if the engine actually overheated, I'd be forced to stop whether I wanted to or not. That's when I remembered the rest area I'd passed on my way up to Portland last month. There was one about 15 miles ahead. Usually had a few truckers parked there even in the middle of the day. Not a town, but better than empty roadside. "There's a rest stop coming up," I said, trying to sound thoughtful rather than desperate. "Better than the shoulder, has shade and everything." He went quiet for a moment, considering, then asked, "The one with the permanent bathroom building or just the portable toilets?" My mind went blank. I couldn't remember, and somehow he seemed to know both options existed on this stretch of road. "The building," I guessed. He smiled that incomplete smile again and said, "No, that one's closed for renovation. Has been for 3 months. But there's a pullout about 5 miles before it. Just a dirt clearing, really. Nobody ever stops there." My knuckles went white on the steering wheel. He knew this road. He knew it better than someone just passing through should know it. Steam started wisping from under the hood, thin white tendrils that meant I had maybe 5 minutes before the engine seized completely. The hitchhiker leaned forward, watching the steam with interest. "Better pull over soon," he said, and his hand moved back to rest on his backpack. "That dirt clearing's just around this next bend. I can help you with the radiator." Every instinct told me not to stop, but the needle was buried in the red now, and the engine started making a grinding sound I'd never heard before. Then I saw it. A highway patrol car parked on the opposite shoulder, about a quarter-mile ahead, radar gun pointed at southbound traffic. Without thinking, I yanked the wheel hard to the right, tires screaming as I cut across both lanes. The hitchhiker grabbed the door handle, shouting, "What the hell are you doing?" I didn't answer, just kept the truck sliding sideways until we skidded to a stop right behind the patrol car, close enough that the officer would have to notice us in his mirrors. The engine died with a mechanical shriek and a cloud of steam that billowed up like a smoke signal. The hitchhiker's pale eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, his whole face showed emotion. Pure, cold rage. "You should have just stopped at the clearing," he said quietly, his hand diving into the backpack. But the patrol officer was already out of his car, walking toward us with that careful cop swagger, hand resting on his utility belt. The hitchhiker's jaw clenched as he re-zipped the bag, forcing his face back into that bland, harmless expression. "Thanks for the ride," he said, climbing out before the officer reached us. "I'll find another way." He started walking back the way we'd come, not forward toward Reno, but back into the desert. The officer asked if everything was okay, and I told him about the overheating, never mentioning the hitchhiker who was already disappearing into the heat shimmer. We both watched him walk until he was just a speck against the sagebrush, then nothing at all. The officer helped me get the truck towed to Lakeview, and I made it to my interview the next day in a rental car. Got the job too, though I only lasted 6 months before moving back to Portland. But here's what haunts me. 2 weeks after my encounter, I was killing time online and decided to search for news about Highway 395. Found an article from 3 days before my trip. A traveling salesman named Robert Henley had gone missing on that exact stretch of road. His car was found at a dirt pullout with the engine cold, keys still in the ignition, his laptop open on the passenger seat showing he'd been researching the Silverado resort for a sales pitch. They found blood on the driver's seat but no body. The article included his photo from a company directory. Same build as my hitchhiker, same age range, but different face, different hair. Then I understood. The hitchhiker knew about my interview because he'd done this before, maybe multiple times. He studied people heading to job interviews, people traveling alone, people nobody would miss right away. He knew that road because he hunted there. I called the tip line and told them everything, but they never found him. Sometimes I think about how he walked back into the desert instead of forward, like he had somewhere specific to go. Like maybe he had a vehicle hidden out there. Like maybe he's still out there, standing on the shoulder with his thumb out, waiting for the next person who doesn't listen to their instincts. The GPS had been cutting in and out for the last hour, leaving me with nothing but endless fields of wheat and a 2-lane highway that seemed to stretch into nowhere. September in Kansas meant the heat still clung to everything, making the asphalt shimmer like water in the distance. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight that Tuesday, fueled by gas station coffee and those protein bars that taste like cardboard covered in chocolate. At 32, I thought I'd have my life more figured out. But there I was, everything I owned packed into my Subaru, heading west to start over in Seattle where my sister lived. The divorce had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, and my boss at the marketing firm in Boston had actually seemed relieved when I handed in my resignation. Sometimes a clean break is exactly what you need, even if it means driving 3,000 miles to get it. Around 2 in the afternoon, maybe 40 miles past the last town I'd seen, this old brick building caught my eye off to the right side of the highway. The faded lettering above the main entrance read, Millbrook Elementary School, though half the letters had fallen off, leaving gaps like missing teeth. Something about abandoned places had always fascinated me, the way nature slowly reclaimed them, the stories they held. I pulled my Subaru onto the gravel access road, tires crunching over broken glass and dried leaves. The building sat maybe 200 feet from the highway, surrounded by overgrown grass that reached up to my thighs in some spots. Every window I could see had been covered with plywood sheets, most of them warped and weathered gray from years of sun and rain. The main entrance door hung slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. I should have just kept driving, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and pushed through the heavy door, which groaned like it hadn't been moved in years. The smell hit me immediately, that distinct mixture of mildew, old paper, and something else I couldn't quite place, almost medicinal. The main hallway stretched out in front of me, lined with closed classroom doors on both sides. What really made me stop in my tracks was how everything looked frozen in time. There were still bulletin boards on the walls with children's artwork, crayon drawings of houses and stick figure families, all faded but intact. A lost and found box sat by what must have been the principal's office, filled with small jackets and a lonely baseball cap with a cartoon dinosaur on it. The first classroom door I tried was unlocked, and when it swung open, I actually gasped out loud. The desks were all still there, arranged in neat rows, and on each one sat an open textbook, pencils scattered across the pages like the kids had just stepped out for recess. But that wasn't the strangest part. Every single desk had a child's coat draped over the back of its chair. Different sizes, different colors, some with cartoon characters, others plain denim or corduroy. I walked between the rows, my footsteps echoing in the empty room, and noticed lunchboxes still sitting on some desks, the metal ones with superheroes and princesses on them that kids used to carry in the 80s. One was open, revealing a sandwich wrapped in plastic that had long since turned into something unrecognizable, but the apple next to it had mummified into a perfect brown sphere. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, thinking nobody would believe this without proof. The blackboard still had math problems written in yellow chalk. Simple addition, the kind second graders would do. Someone had drawn a smiley face in the corner with "Great job" written underneath. As I moved to get a better angle, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. On the teacher's desk, there was the attendance sheet dated March 15, 1987, with 23 names listed. Every single name had a check mark next to it. A red pen lay beside it, cap off, the tip dried and cracked. Next to that sat a coffee mug with "World's Best Teacher" printed on it, still half filled with what had once been coffee, but now looked like tar. The teacher's chair was pushed back from the desk at an odd angle, like someone had stood up quickly and never returned. That's when I heard it. Footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully across the floor. The building was supposed to be 2 stories. I'd noticed that from outside. My first thought was maybe another urban explorer, someone else who'd seen the place from the highway. But something about the rhythm of those steps made my mouth go dry. They were too measured, too purposeful, moving in a straight line across what must have been the room directly above me. Then they stopped, right above where I was standing. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I held my breath, waiting, and after maybe 30 seconds the footsteps started again, this time moving toward what I assumed was a stairwell. The old wooden floor above creaked with each step, dust falling through tiny cracks in the ceiling tiles, drifting down like snow in the beam of sunlight coming through the doorway. I backed out of the classroom slowly, trying not to make any noise, but the old linoleum floor had other ideas. Every step produced a sticky, peeling sound as my shoes pulled away from the grimy surface. The footsteps upstairs had stopped again, and I had the horrible feeling that whoever was up there was listening to me just as intently as I was listening to them. The hallway seemed longer than it had been when I'd entered, and those closed classroom doors on either side suddenly felt threatening, like something might burst out from behind any one of them. I reached the main entrance area where weak sunlight filtered through the gap in the front door, and that's when I saw it. Fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the entrance toward the stairs at the far end of the hallway. They weren't my footprints. These were larger, made by work boots with deep treads, and they looked recent, maybe only hours old. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself following those footprints toward the stairwell. The door to the stairs was one of those heavy fire doors with the narrow window reinforced with wire mesh. Through the grime-covered glass, I could barely make out the stairs ascending into darkness. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the loud squeal of rusty hinges. The stairwell smelled different from the rest of the building, less musty, more lived in. There were candy wrappers on the steps, modern ones I recognized from gas stations. An empty water bottle sat on the landing halfway up. Someone had definitely been using this place, and recently. As I stood there at the bottom of the stairs, I heard movement again from above. Not footsteps this time, but a dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. Then a voice, muffled but definitely human, said something I couldn't make out. Then another voice responded, younger sounding, maybe a teenager. My brain finally kicked into survival mode, and I turned to head back toward the entrance. But as I pushed through the stairwell door, I nearly collided with a man standing in the hallway. He was maybe 50, wearing stained coveralls and work boots that matched the prints on the floor. His face was weathered and deeply lined, with pale blue eyes that didn't blink as he stared at me. Behind him stood a younger guy, probably 17 or 18, thin and nervous-looking with greasy hair hanging over his eyes. They were both between me and the exit. The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well now," he said, his voice raspy like he'd been smoking for decades. "We don't get many visitors out here." His hand moved to his pocket, and I saw the outline of something that might have been a knife. The younger one kept glancing between me and the older man, like he was waiting for instructions. "I was just leaving," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady while taking a step backward toward the stairs. The older man shook his head slowly. "Can't have you doing that just yet. See, this is our place, has been for a good while now. We got a nice setup upstairs. Been living here almost 3 months since my brother here aged out of foster care and had nowhere else to go." He gestured to the younger guy who looked at the floor. "Problem is, we can't have people knowing about our little arrangement. The county would run us off, probably try to put him back in the system." He took a step closer, and I could smell him. Sweat, cigarettes, and something chemical. "So here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna hand over your phone and your car keys, and we're all gonna go upstairs to figure out how to handle this situation." The younger one finally looked up at me, and there was something desperate in his eyes, almost apologetic. That's when I remembered the pepper spray attached to my keychain. In one quick motion, I yanked my keys from my pocket and sprayed directly at the older man's face. He screamed and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes, crashing into his brother who tried to catch him. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, slamming through the entrance door so hard it bounced off the exterior wall. Behind me, I could hear the older man yelling obscenities, his voice echoing through the building. My car was only 50 feet away, but it felt like a mile. I fumbled with the keys, my fingers slick with sweat, finally getting the door open and throwing myself inside. In the rearview mirror, I saw the younger one standing in the doorway of the school. Not chasing me, just watching. The older man appeared behind him, his face red and streaming with tears from the pepper spray. But he wasn't pursuing either. They just stood there as I started the engine and floored it back to the highway, gravel spraying everywhere. I drove for 2 hours straight before I stopped, my whole body shaking so bad I could barely hold the steering wheel. At a busy truck stop near Topeka, I finally felt safe enough to call the police. They took my report seriously, especially when I mentioned the evidence of someone living there and the implied threat with the knife. 2 days later, a detective called me. They'd raided the school and found an elaborate living space on the second floor. Sleeping bags, a camping stove, boxes of canned goods, even a generator. The 2 men were brothers, just like the older one had said. They'd been squatting there after the younger one left foster care with nowhere to go. They found my description matched perfectly, and they also found something else, the belongings of at least 3 other people who'd stopped to explore that school over the past few months. Wallets, phones, even a laptop. The detective wouldn't tell me exactly what they thought had happened to those people, just that they were investigating multiple missing persons cases. They arrested both brothers, and I had to give my statement over the phone since I was already in Idaho by then. The older brother, Nathan Briggs, had a record: assault, theft, drug manufacturing. The younger one, Jamie, was just 18 with no record, and the detective said he seemed relieved to be arrested. I still think about that look he gave me in the hallway, like he wanted to warn me but couldn't. Never found out what happened at that school in 1987, why everything was left exactly as it was, but I know what was happening there in 2022, and sometimes that's worse than any ghost story. The rain started around 6 that evening, right when we were halfway between Memphis and Little Rock on some back road my cousin Tony insisted would save us 2 hours. I was driving my beat-up Ford Explorer with Tony riding shotgun, and his girlfriend Melissa passed out in the back, exhausted from the wedding we'd just left in Tennessee. We'd been on the road for nearly 4 hours already, and what began as light drizzle had turned into the kind of downpour where your wipers can't keep up no matter how fast they're going. The GPS on Tony's phone had lost signal about 20 minutes earlier, and we were basically guessing our way through these winding country roads, hoping to hit something familiar. Every street sign we passed was either too weathered to read or completely obscured by the sheets of water cascading down. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, leaning forward like those extra 6 inches would somehow help me see through the wall of rain hammering the windshield. Tony kept saying we should pull over somewhere, anywhere, just to wait it out for a bit, and honestly I was starting to agree with him. The Explorer's old tires weren't exactly gripping the road like they used to, and every time we hit a puddle, I could feel the car wanting to hydroplane. When we saw what looked like a wide driveway or maybe a small parking area off to the right, with a single streetlight creating this hazy yellow bubble in all that rain, I didn't even think twice about pulling in. The relief of getting off that dark road was immediate. At least here we could sit still and catch our breath without worrying about someone rear-ending us in the storm. The driveway was longer than I expected, gravel crunching under our tires as we rolled about 30 feet in from the main road. There was a house at the end, maybe another 50 feet ahead, but with the rain and the darkness, all we could really make out was the porch light and what might have been a truck parked near the garage. I shifted into park, kept the engine running for the heat, and we all just sat there for a minute, listening to the rain pound on the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Maybe 5 minutes passed, could have been less, but it felt longer with all of us just sitting there in that weird bubble of calm while the storm raged outside. Melissa had woken up and was checking her phone. Tony was messing with the radio trying to find a weather report, and I was staring at that house, noticing little things. The way one of the upstairs windows had this flickering blue light like someone was watching TV. How there were these metal wind chimes on the porch getting absolutely battered by the wind, making this eerie tinkling sound we could hear even over the rain. That's when the front door flew open, and this guy came charging out like he'd been shot from a cannon. He was wearing what looked like pajama pants and a white tank top that was soaked through in seconds. But what really got my attention was the aluminum baseball bat he was carrying, holding it up like he was ready to take someone's head off. The porch light lit him up perfectly. Middle-aged, thick beard, barefoot on wet concrete, and absolutely furious. He was screaming something, but between the rain and our windows being up, we couldn't make out the words at first. Then he got closer, maybe 10 feet from my driver's side door, and I could hear him clear as day even through the glass in the storm. "Get the hell off my property now!" He was pointing that bat at us, jabbing it in the air with each word, rain streaming down his face, making him look absolutely unhinged. Tony immediately threw his hands up like we were being robbed, and I started fumbling with the gear shift, trying to throw it in reverse while yelling back that we were leaving. We were sorry, we just needed to get out of the rain for a second. But this guy wasn't having any of it. He took another step closer and swung that bat through the air, not at us, but like a warning, and I swear I could hear it whistle. Melissa was suddenly very awake, grabbing the back of my seat and telling me to just go. Just get us out of there. And I was trying, but my hands were slick with sweat, and the rain on the windows made it impossible to see behind us. The guy started walking around at Tony's side, still yelling about calling the cops, about us knowing exactly what we were doing. about how he was sick of people thinking they could just pull this crap. I finally got the Explorer in reverse and started backing up, but driving backwards down a gravel driveway in that kind of rain was like trying to thread a needle while someone's shaking your arm. The backup camera was basically useless, just showing a blur of red from the taillights reflecting off the water, and I was twisted around in my seat trying to see through the rear window while Tony kept one eye on the guy with the bat and one eye on what was behind us. We'd made it maybe 15 feet when there was this explosive sound, like someone had set off a firecracker inside the car, and the whole rear window just spiderwebbed into a million pieces. Glass chunks went everywhere. Melissa screamed and ducked down behind the seats. Tony was yelling something I couldn't process, and I slammed on the brakes without thinking, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. Through the shattered window, which was somehow still holding together despite being completely destroyed, I caught a glimpse of another figure in the darkness behind us, just a silhouette against the streetlight, holding what looked like a crowbar or a tire iron. The guy with the bat was now running toward us, feet slipping on the wet gravel but still coming fast, and whoever was behind us was moving too, coming around to the passenger side where Melissa was crouched down. My brain went into this weird overdrive mode where everything felt both too fast and too slow at the same time. I threw the car back into drive, cranked the wheel hard to the left, and floored it across what I realized too late was this guy's front lawn. The Explorer's tires spun for a second in the wet grass before catching, and we went bouncing and sliding across the yard, taking out what sounded like a garden gnome or a lawn ornament, the headlights swinging wildly as I tried to get us back to the driveway. Tony was shouting directions I couldn't follow. Melissa was crying, and through it all I could hear both of those guys yelling, their voices getting closer even though we were moving. The bat guy actually took a swing at Tony's window as we passed him, and the crack it made against the glass was so loud we all flinched, but thankfully the window held. Somehow, probably through pure luck and adrenaline, I managed to get us back onto the gravel and pointed toward the road. But now the Explorer was making this horrible grinding noise from the rear passenger side, like we damaged something important when we went off-roading through this psycho's yard. The shattered rear window was starting to cave in, pieces of glass falling into the back seat where Melissa was still hunched down, and the rain was now coming into the car, soaking everything. I could see the main road ahead, maybe 20 feet away, and I pressed the gas pedal all the way to the floor, not caring about the grinding noise or the way the car was pulling to the right. Just as we hit the pavement, I caught sight of the second guy in my side mirror, younger than Batman, maybe early 20s, wearing a yellow raincoat that made him look like something out of a horror movie, and he was running full sprint after us. For one terrifying second, I thought he might actually catch up and grab onto the car, but then we were on the road and picking up speed, leaving both of them standing in that driveway, getting smaller in the mirrors. But here's the part that still messes with me when I think about it. As we were speeding away, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and that house, Tony noticed something that made everything even worse. There were other cars pulled off on the side of the road near that property, 3 or 4 of them, all empty, all with their hazard lights blinking in the rain. One of them, a silver sedan, had its driver door hanging open, the interior light on, rain pooling on the seat. Another one, a pickup truck, had what looked like the same kind of spiderweb crack in its windshield that we now had in our rear window. Tony kept saying we should stop, we should call someone, but I just kept driving, my foot locked on that accelerator, because whatever was happening at that house, whatever those guys were doing to people who stopped near their property, I didn't want to stick around to become another abandoned car on the side of that road. The grinding noise got worse as we drove, and about 3 miles later the rear tire on that side completely shredded, forcing us to pull into a 24-hour gas station where we finally called the police. The cops who showed up, 2 officers in their 30s who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on a night like this, took our statements while we stood under the fluorescent lights of the gas station canopy, all 3 of us soaked and shaking. They kept exchanging these looks when we described what happened, and finally the older one, Officer Daniels, according to his name tag, asked us if we were sure about the address, if we could point out exactly where this happened on his tablet map. When we showed him, he got this expression on his face like someone had just told him his worst suspicion was confirmed. He walked back to his patrol car to make a call, leaving his partner with us. And when he came back, he had a whole different energy, urgent, serious, like we'd stumbled into something bigger than just some crazy homeowner. He told us they'd been getting reports about that property for months, cars being vandalized, people being threatened, but this was the first time anyone had actually been attacked while trying to leave. Turns out the owner, some guy named Walter Briggs, had convinced himself that people were using his driveway to case his house for robbery, and he'd recruited his nephew to help him defend the property. What really got me was when Officer Daniels showed us photos on his tablet from previous incidents. At least 7 other vehicles had been damaged over the past 6 weeks, all during rainstorms when visibility was bad, and people were just looking for a safe place to pull over. One couple had their windshield completely smashed in, another person had their tires slashed while they were still sitting in the car, and there was even a family with kids who got chased down the road just like us, their minivan getting pelted with rocks. The police had been building a case, but Walter and his nephew, whose name was Drew, we learned, were careful about staying just on the edge of what they could prove was criminal assault versus property defense. But our incident, with the rear window being smashed while we were actively trying to leave, with Melissa being a clear witness from the back seat, plus the damage to the car from being forced to flee across the lawn, this was what they needed. They had us write out detailed statements right there on the hood of the patrol car, the rain still coming down but lighter now, and said they'd be going out to the property that night with backup. The gas station clerk, this older woman who'd been watching everything unfold from behind the register, came out with a roll of clear packing tape and helped us seal up the rear window as best we could, so we could at least make it home without getting completely drenched. She told us she'd seen other people come in with similar damage over the past month, always during storms, always with that same terrified look we probably had on our faces. One guy had come in with his elderly mother, both of them so shaken they couldn't even speak properly for the first 10 minutes. Just sat in the store drinking coffee until they calmed down enough to call for help. While she was talking, helping Tony hold the plastic in place while I taped, she mentioned something that made everything click into place. Walter Briggs had apparently lost his wife in a home invasion 3 years prior, 2 towns over, and after he moved to this property, he'd become increasingly paranoid, installing cameras, motion sensors, even bear traps, which the county made him remove, around his land. The nephew, Drew, had moved in with him about 8 months ago, supposedly to help take care of him, but seemed to be feeding into his uncle's paranoia instead of getting him help. We ended up driving home with that makeshift plastic window, going about 40 miles per hour the whole way because the tire was barely holding together and the alignment was completely shot from our off-road escape. Insurance covered the damage eventually, after a lengthy back and forth where we had to provide the police report, our statements, and photos of everything. About a month later, Tony forwarded me a news article. Walter Briggs and Drew had been arrested and charged with multiple counts of assault, criminal threatening, and destruction of property. The article mentioned at least 12 victims had come forward after hearing about the arrests, including a pregnant woman who'd gone into early labor from the stress of being attacked. The property had been seized as evidence, and in the photos they showed, you could see the driveway we'd pulled into, looking so innocent in the daylight, just a normal gravel drive leading to a regular house. Walter got 2 years in prison plus mandatory psychiatric treatment. Drew got 18 months, and both were ordered to pay restitution to all the victims. I still think about that night sometimes when it's raining hard and I need to pull over. I always choose well-lit gas stations or rest stops now. Never private property, no matter how innocent it looks. Last October, I was driving from Minneapolis to visit my sister in Des Moines when something happened that still makes my chest tighten whenever I think about it. I was 26 then, had just gotten promoted at the marketing firm where I worked, and decided to take the scenic route through rural Iowa instead of sticking to Interstate 35. The GPS showed these winding county roads that would supposedly save me 40 minutes, and I figured why not enjoy some countryside views during the 5-hour drive. It was a Wednesday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, and the autumn colors were gorgeous, all those burnt oranges and deep reds against the cloudy sky. I remember singing along to some throwback playlist, windows cracked just enough to let in that crisp fall air, feeling pretty good about life in general. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere between these tiny towns I'd never heard of, the landscape started changing from farmhouses and cornfields to these long stretches of nothing but overgrown grass and scattered trees. The road had narrowed to barely 2 lanes, that rough asphalt with patches of gravel where the county hadn't bothered fixing potholes. I hadn't seen another car for maybe 20 minutes, just me and the occasional hawk circling overhead. That's when I spotted him. This guy standing next to what looked like a beaten-up Ford pickup, hood popped open, steam or smoke rising from the engine. He was waving both arms above his head in that desperate way people do when they really need help, wearing this faded flannel jacket and jeans that looked soaked from the knees down, like he'd been walking through the wet grass. My first instinct was to help. I mean, the poor guy was stranded in the middle of nowhere, and I knew what that felt like from when my alternator died on a back road in college. I eased off the gas and started slowing down, already mentally preparing what I could offer. Maybe a ride to the nearest town, or letting him use my phone to call someone. As I got closer, maybe about 50 feet away, I could see more details. He was probably in his 40s, had this scraggly beard with gray patches, and his face was all red and sweaty like he'd been trying to fix that truck for hours. But something made me glance to the right side of the road, just this automatic thing you do when you're about to stop somewhere unfamiliar. The grass there was really tall, probably waist-high, all yellow and brown from the season, swaying in the wind. That's when I saw it. Just this slight movement that wasn't matching the rhythm of the wind. There was someone crouched down in that grass, maybe 30 feet from where the truck was parked. I could only make out parts of them through the stalks. A dark jacket, what looked like a baseball cap, and they were definitely watching my car approach. They were positioned perfectly so that if I had pulled over behind the truck, I would have ended up right between them and the man who was waving. My foot moved from the brake to the gas pedal so fast I don't even remember making the conscious decision. The man must have seen my car suddenly speed up instead of stopping because his waving turned into this angry gesture, and then he actually started running toward the road like he was going to try to block me. I slammed the accelerator harder than I've ever pushed it in my life, and my little Honda Accord lurched forward with this grinding sound from the engine. The speedometer jumped from 20 to 60 in seconds on that narrow road, and I had to grip the steering wheel with both hands to keep control on the uneven pavement. In my rearview mirror, I could see the man had made it to the middle of the road where I would have been if I'd stopped, and the person from the grass was now standing up, fully visible. It was another man, younger, wearing all dark clothes, and he was holding something in his right hand. I couldn't tell what it was, maybe a crowbar or a pipe. They both stood there watching my car disappear around the bend, and the older one kicked at the ground and threw his arms up like he was cursing at me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the engine noise, and I didn't slow down for at least 3 miles, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure no one was following me. The really messed up part is what happened when I finally got cell service again about 15 minutes later. I pulled into this little gas station in the next town, still shaking, and called the police to report what happened. The officer I spoke to asked me to describe the exact location, and when I told him about the county road between those 2 towns, he got really quiet for a moment. Then he said they'd had 2 reports in the past month of people getting robbed on that same stretch of road. Both times it was someone who'd stopped to help what looked like a stranded motorist. One was a retired teacher who got his wallet and phone stolen, and the other was a college kid who they roughed up pretty bad when he tried to fight back. The officer took down all my information and said they'd send a patrol out there immediately, but those guys were probably long gone by then. What really stuck with me from that conversation was when the officer mentioned that in both previous cases, the victims said there was something weird about how the supposed broken-down truck was positioned. It was always parked at spots where you couldn't easily turn around, either near a ditch, a fence line, or where the shoulder dropped off steeply. Mine was the same way. I realized later that if I'd pulled over where that man was directing me, I would have been boxed in between his truck, the drainage ditch on the right, and whoever was hiding in that grass. The officer said I was lucky I noticed the second person, because most people don't look around carefully when they think they're doing a good deed. He also mentioned that they suspected there might be a third person involved, maybe someone who stays with a getaway vehicle parked further up the road, but they hadn't been able to confirm it. The whole thing was apparently sophisticated enough that they'd been doing it for a while without getting caught. I sat in my car at that gas station for another hour, too rattled to keep driving. I called my sister to tell her what happened, and she completely freaked out, made me promise to stay on the interstate for the rest of the trip. While I was sitting there, this older woman who worked at the station came out for a smoke break and asked if I was okay. I guess I looked pretty shaken up. When I told her what happened, she nodded like she wasn't surprised at all and said locals knew to never stop on that particular stretch of road anymore. She told me her nephew had seen the same setup about 6 weeks earlier, but hadn't reported it because he thought maybe he was being paranoid. According to her, the men usually targeted people with out-of-state plates or newer cars, figuring they'd have money or valuable stuff. She even said there were rumors they had a woman working with them sometimes, someone who would play the stranded motorist role to make female drivers feel safer about stopping. The rest of my drive to Des Moines was a blur of paranoia and adrenaline crashes. Every time I saw a vehicle on the shoulder, even on the busy interstate, my whole body would tense up. I kept replaying those few seconds in my head, the way that grass moved, the glimpse of that dark figure crouching there, waiting. What haunted me most was thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't noticed him. Would they have just robbed me? Or was it going to be worse? The police officer had been vague about what happened to that college kid who fought back, just said he was roughed up pretty bad. But the way he said it made me think it was probably more serious than he was letting on. I made it to my sister's place around 7 that evening, and the moment she opened the door, I just broke down crying. All that fear I'd been holding in during the drive just came pouring out, and I couldn't stop shaking for probably 20 minutes. My sister's husband, Kevin, got really angry when he heard the full story and wanted to drive back out there with some of his buddies to look for those guys. We had to talk him out of it, explaining that the police were handling it and that these criminals were obviously dangerous and organized. He ended up calling his brother, who's a state trooper in Illinois, asking him to check if there were similar incidents in other states. Turns out, there were reports of comparable setups along rural routes in Missouri and Wisconsin over the past year. Same pattern with the fake breakdown, someone hiding, targeting lone drivers. Kevin's brother said these groups sometimes move around different states to avoid getting caught by local police, and they usually have police scanners to know when to clear out. That night I barely slept, kept having these vivid dreams where I'd stopped the car, and that man in the grass was suddenly at my window, tapping on the glass with that metal object. The next morning, my sister drove me to a rental car place because I was too nervous to drive my own car back home. I kept thinking maybe they'd gotten my license plate number and would track me down somehow. I know that sounds paranoid, but I couldn't shake the fear. We rented a different vehicle, a silver SUV with tinted windows, and my sister actually followed me in her car for the first hour of my trip back to Minneapolis, just to make sure I felt safe. Before I left, Kevin had installed one of those dashboard cameras in the rental and showed me how to use it, saying if anything happened again, at least I'd have evidence. The drive back was completely uneventful. I took the main interstate the whole way, stopped only at busy rest stops with lots of people around, and made it home in record time. But for weeks afterward, I'd get these random panic attacks while driving, especially if I saw someone on the side of the road. I ended up talking to a therapist about it, and she said what I experienced was a legitimate trauma response, that my instincts had saved me from real danger. About 3 weeks later, I got a call from that same police officer who'd taken my report. They'd arrested 2 men matching the descriptions I'd given after another attempted robbery went wrong. Apparently, The driver they tried to stop was an off-duty corrections officer who had a dash cam running and managed to get clear footage of both men and their license plate. The officer said my report had helped establish the pattern and timeline, and they needed me to look at some photos to see if these were the same guys. I identified them immediately. That scraggly beard with gray patches was unmistakable, and the younger one had these deep-set eyes that I'll never forget. They both ended up pleading guilty to multiple counts of robbery and assault, got sentenced to several years in prison. The police never found the third person everyone suspected was involved, and that still bothers me sometimes. I changed my route preferences on all my GPS apps after that, choosing fastest route over shortest route every single time now. And I don't care if it means sitting in traffic on the interstate rather than taking those isolated back roads. It was the fall after I finished my first year at community college, and my older brother Michael had just gotten a used Ford sedan that he was ridiculously proud of. We decided to take a long road trip across the country, partly as an excuse for him to test the car on highways outside of our small town, and partly because we both needed a break from our routines. At the time, I didn't have much going on, just a part-time job at a hardware store, and a vague idea of transferring to a bigger university. Michael was working odd shifts at a warehouse, saving money but always looking for excuses to escape responsibility for a while. That trip felt like freedom, like we had no one watching us and no real schedule to keep. The first couple of days were fun. We'd take turns driving, stop at random diners that looked like they hadn't changed since the 70s, and argue over which gas stations had the cheapest coffee. The car had a faint smell of old leather mixed with motor oil, and Michael kept a cooler in the back seat filled with energy drinks and sandwiches wrapped in foil. It was the kind of road trip where nothing mattered except the open road and the endless playlists we blasted from a scratched-up CD collection he'd refused to throw away. It was late afternoon on the third day when we saw him, a guy standing by the shoulder, thumb out, holding a backpack that looked like it had seen better years. He had dark, greasy hair tied back into a short ponytail and wore a faded denim jacket with patches I couldn't make sense of. The moment Michael slowed down, I felt uneasy. I remember muttering, "Do we really want to do this?" He shrugged and said, "It's just a ride to the next town, don't be paranoid." Against my better judgment, I stayed quiet as we pulled over. The man slid into the back seat without hesitation, like he had been waiting specifically for us. His bag hit the seat with a heavy thud, and he leaned forward between us as Michael asked where he was headed. "East," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Anywhere past here." That alone was vague enough to put me on edge. Within minutes, he wasn't making small talk. He was asking personal things. He wanted to know our last names, which route we were taking, if we had family waiting for us at our destination. The way he phrased it wasn't casual curiosity. It felt deliberate, like he was checking details we hadn't offered up. Michael tried to keep things light, joking about how we were just two brothers killing time on the road, but the hitchhiker barely smiled. He leaned closer, asking me if our parents knew we were traveling, if they worried about us. The way he said it made my chest tighten, like he was probing for weaknesses. I kept my answers vague, saying stuff like, "Yeah, they know," without giving details. Every time I glanced at the rearview mirror, his eyes were locked on me instead of the road. It felt like being studied. About half an hour later, we pulled into a small gas station with peeling paint and a single flickering light above the pumps. I figured this would be our chance to let him out, so I said, "We're stopping here for a bit." Michael parked and cut the engine. I expected the guy to gather his bag and thank us before moving on, but he just stayed seated, hands resting on the strap of his backpack. Michael got out to pump gas, leaving me in the car with him, and the silence was unbearable. The ticking of the cooling engine sounded louder than it should have. I cleared my throat and asked, "So, you getting out here?" He slowly shook his head. "Not yet," he said, his voice flat, like it wasn't even up for debate. His eyes drifted toward the convenience store. and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd head inside. Instead, he leaned back against the seat and muttered something I couldn't fully catch. The air in the car felt heavier, and I was suddenly aware of how small the space was with him inside. Michael climbed back in with 2 sodas, trying to act normal, but I saw the way his smile faltered when he realized the hitchhiker hadn't moved. He whispered to me under his breath, "We'll figure it out down the road." I didn't answer. The man finally spoke up again, asking Michael if he could ride just a little longer. But the way he said it didn't sound like a request. It sounded like a warning, like leaving him behind wasn't an option. We drove another 20 minutes with him sitting there, and the tension only grew. He started asking about our hometown, repeating the name back to us like he was committing it to memory. At one point, he leaned forward again and asked Michael if the car doors locked properly. That made my heart race. Michael gave a vague yeah and kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tighter than usual. I stared out the window, pretending not to listen, but every word he said seemed loaded. When we spotted another gas station ahead, Michael gave me a quick glance. Without speaking, I knew what he was thinking. He pulled in, parked beside the pumps, and this time left the keys in the ignition. He got out like he was just stretching, then motioned for me to follow. I slid out slowly, keeping my voice casual. "I'm gonna grab a snack." The hitchhiker didn't move. He just sat there in the back seat, staring straight ahead, like we were the ones intruding on his ride. Inside the store, Michael whispered, "We're not getting back in that car with him." We asked the clerk if there was a payphone we could use, but it was out of order. Michael decided to go around the building and call the police from his cell. Reception was terrible out there, but somehow he managed to get through. We waited inside the store, peeking through the window. The man never left the car. He just sat there, still as stone, hand resting on his backpack like he was guarding it. It took about 20 minutes, but eventually a sheriff's cruiser pulled in. The deputy approached the car, tapped on the window, and after a short conversation, the hitchhiker finally stepped out. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, just slung his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the cruiser like he'd been expecting this the whole time. The deputy drove off with him, and we were left standing there in the fluorescent glow of the store, not sure what to say. We finished our trip, but the rest of the drive felt heavier, quieter. To this day, I wonder what was in that backpack and why he had chosen us. I remember that night clearly, because my family and I were exhausted from hours on the road, and the only option we had was to pull over at a rest area. It wasn't one of those big, brightly lit places with a convenience store, just a small stop off the highway with a couple of vending machines and a row of parked trucks humming in the dark. My wife, Emily, climbed into the back seat with our daughter, who was only 7 at the time, while I reclined in the driver's seat and tried to settle in. The sound of distant engines and the occasional gust of wind against the car made it difficult to relax, but eventually, the 3 of us drifted into an uneasy sleep. What pulled me out of it wasn't a noise, but a strange heaviness in the air, the kind you only notice once you're fully awake. My first thought was that condensation had built up on the windows, since it was a cool night. But when I leaned forward and rubbed at the glass with my sleeve, I realized the marks weren't fog. They were greasy smears, long streaks that looked like someone had dragged their fingers down the window. The realization hit me slowly, and when I turned to check the other side, there were more of them. Handprints, smudged and oily, pressed against the glass as if someone had been leaning close, watching. Emily stirred in the back seat, groggy and confused, asking what I was doing. I didn't want to scare her, so I just said the window was dirty. But in the faint glow of the streetlight, I caught a clear impression of a palm, complete with the marks of the ridges, like whoever touched it had pressed hard and left a greasy outline. My chest tightened as I quietly scanned the parking area. Most of the semis were still, their cabins dark, and I didn't see anyone walking around. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been right next to us while we were asleep, maybe even leaning over to peek inside. By morning, we were all restless and ready to leave that spot behind. I mentioned the handprints to Emily, but we both brushed it off as maybe some kind of residue left earlier. even though I knew that didn't explain why the marks were so fresh. When I went to grab a coffee from the vending machine, I noticed a security camera mounted above the building. On a whim, I asked the attendant who came in to clean the place if they could check the footage for me. He agreed, scrolling through the grainy black and white recording, and that's when we saw it, an unfamiliar man pacing slowly around our car. For nearly an hour, he circled, leaned close to the windows, and stood still long enough that his face practically pressed against the glass. The footage didn't show his face clearly, just the outline of a man in a hooded jacket, pausing every so often as if he were debating what to do next. At one point, he bent close enough that the grainy image showed his head turning toward the back seat where Emily and our daughter slept. Watching it made my throat tighten. It was almost unbearable to realize how unaware we had been. The part that really unsettled me was the way he lingered, not rushing, not wandering randomly. He was deliberate, like he had all the time in the world to study us. The attendant stopped the video and looked at me like he didn't want to say the words out loud. I asked if the police should be called, but since the guy never technically broke into the car or touched us, the attendant just shrugged and said there wasn't much they could do. That left me with this gnawing unease, standing there with a styrofoam cup of bitter coffee, trying to process that while we slept. A stranger was right there, circling us like prey. I didn't even want to get back in the car, but we had no choice. We needed to keep driving. When I told Emily about the footage, she went pale and immediately checked our daughter, still curled up with her blanket in the back seat. The greasy handprints were still visible, smeared across the glass like stains that refused to fade. I ended up wiping them away with a handful of napkins before pulling out of the lot. But even as the marks disappeared, the feeling they carried stayed with us. Every mile we drove after that, I caught myself scanning the side mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following too closely. That day became one long blur of cautious silence. Emily kept glancing at the back seat, her eyes fixed on our daughter, while I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, forcing myself to stay alert. The road stretched endlessly, but my mind was locked on the image of that hooded figure circling us in the dark. It wasn't just that he had been there, it was that he hadn't done anything. He didn't break in, didn't run off when we stirred, didn't reveal himself. He just waited, like he was content leaving a mark behind to let us know we'd been watched. Later that afternoon, when we stopped for gas, I caught sight of our car's rear window under the sunlight, and my stomach tightened again. Even after scrubbing earlier, faint smudges remained, like fingerprints etched into the glass itself. Emily noticed them too, and neither of us said a word. It was like admitting out loud that they were still there would give them more weight. We fueled up quickly, avoided eye contact with anyone around us, and got back on the road without lingering. That night, after we finally reached a motel in a different town, I went over the car with a flashlight. I checked the doors, the locks, even peeked underneath as if I expected to find someone hiding. Nothing. But when I tilted the light across the driver's side window, there was a faint oval mark, shaped like a face pressed close against the glass. The greasy outline curved where a forehead and nose would have been. I stood there for a long time, flashlight trembling in my hand, realizing that while we slept, he hadn't just circled. He had leaned in close enough to leave part of himself behind. Emily didn't want me to mention it in front of our daughter, so I kept it to myself until years later. Even now, every time we talk about that trip, she brings up how uneasy she felt, how she kept thinking she would open her eyes in the middle of the night to see a stranger's face inches away. For her, the footage was haunting enough, but for me, it's that single impression left on the glass, the undeniable proof that someone had been studying us in silence. We never found out who he was, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Maybe he was just a drifter with strange habits, or maybe his intentions were worse and something stopped him from acting on them. What stays with me is the knowledge that while we slept, feeling secure in our locked car, a stranger was out there, circling, pressing his hands and face to the glass as if testing the boundary between us. And even though it ended without him breaking in, that night changed the way I travel forever. I don't park in rest areas anymore. I don't trust dark lots. Because once you've seen your own window carrying the print of an unknown face, you realize just how thin that barrier really is.